while it's in the cloud and while we have URLs for that are accessible everywhere, this is not something we show the client, right?
Development server setups.
Yes.
How does that work at Bleach? How did you set that up? It's like, this is one of those topics where I can't contribute that much to, but you know all the details. Could you please lead into the topic?
Yes. So development server setup, what does it mean? We are in a big team, right? There are multiple people working on projects, on the same projects, sharing data, sharing other stuff. And we use WordPress. So we are always dependent on a database. We are always dependent on also file uploads that were made to some instance. And we want to have actually a unified approach, so that not somebody develops on some data base or like base data, like and some people work with other data. So we want everything to be the same for everyone. And we have put a lot of thought into that. Have like a more or less complicated setup, but what's the most important thing for your development? And we basically, okay, how do I start? Where do I start already? Or do you have questions?
Deep into it already.
Yeah.
I just thought maybe we could start with a bit of a history, how we started, because I remember when we started, more than 10 years ago. In the beginning, we didn't have very sophisticated setups, right? But then we started working on several setups, and maybe explain a bit about how it started, what we tried, and what we ended up with now, kind of.
Yeah. Okay. Well, big topic. So the first, when we started, at least in our field, even Git wasn't such a big thing, right? So
exactly,
Git and GitHub were just I don't know when GitHub started. GitHub did, of course, exist back then, but it wasn't so popular for everything. It was mainly you FTP'd onto a production server actually to make small changes, right? And you had
the first website where you actually every change was just made on production, kind of, right? The very early days.
And I know you had the super Mac based setup with Coda, the software, right, where you had all of your projects, the credentials for production and so on, saved in the software. So it was really easy for you to make changes here and there and so on, right?
It was just a click, right? And I could make changes everywhere, and websites weren't that complicated. So that also, it kind of worked. It was just the way how to do things back then, I remember. And also, but Git wasn't big. However, I remember one of our, if not the first project that we did together, I wrote some kind of shell script which would create a tarball based on Git versions, and then deploy that to a server with a tag version where you could then. That was a Slack call. Wow! Why am I'm in focus mode on my computer and still a Slack call goes through? Interesting. I'm gonna call you back later. So it was a tarball, and that tarball version was created based on a Git version number, and then you could deploy that via SSH, but with a manual deploy step, or manual upload and a manual deploy step.
You sure that this was a tarball and SSH? And because I remember this Git deploy function that we also wrote, but this was based on FTP. So you uploaded, you changed a revision number on a file in the server, and then checked, okay, what changed, and then you just deployed the changes, the Git diffs.
I think that was one of the first versions that we did together at Bleach. Then, we saved all the the project code in Git, but in the very early days, I think we also put parts of WordPress into the Git repository because we didn't know how to structure that. And then, we created some kind of Git FTP command to deploy diffs to the server. Yeah. Okay, but this is like probably going too much about like all the deployment setups and so on. Let's maybe focus on development setups.
Yes.
How do we ensure that people do have the same or similar environments and code base and database and assets?
Yeah, I think for me the most like the first part is like we have like everyone has a local machine, right? Everyone has a local environment that they develop on. And this local environment is basically kind of connected to a development environment. And the development environment is like a shared server that's also like available on the internet. Like it's always protected. But there we have a database and like a file system. And this is the source of truth for your local environment, right? So basically, whenever you start to work on a new feature, you run a command. We like in our projects, we have a run file, like just a file where all of the commands for a given project are, and it usually starts with like run clone, and run clone will clone the development database and the development assets uploads to your local environment, so that you have a clean slate basically, and every change that you make to your local environment is then lost, right? So yeah. This is basically the first thing that we do. And sometimes another interesting topic that I don't know if we want to like go into that right now, but maybe later we can touch on that again, is that sometimes the local environment isn't actually local, right? Because what we have figured out, like we have a lot of like legacy projects, right? Clients that have a maintenance contract with us, they sometimes go back like a couple of years, right? And not all the time there is the budget for like updating all dependencies to the latest versions. And with that, I mean like especially for the build process. So we're doing WordPress, right? But we have a heavily a JavaScript-based build process that we use. And there are a lot of dependencies that like keeping those up to date would actually be quite an effort all the time. So, and in the past, we've noticed that whenever somebody new starts to work on an old project, this takes forever for them to set up this project on their machine. And while there are some, of course, there are solutions like making everything Docker based, having a Docker like file or like even a Docker Compose file for starting that. We never adopted Docker for our development environment. Maybe some more on that later as well. But what we ended up doing now is we have set up a support server, sort of, that has where we have installed all of our support projects. And the way that somebody works on it is via VS Code. They have this awesome feature, VS Code Remote, via SSH. So you can basically just connect to this server via SSH in VS Code. And basically, it feels like you're working on your local machine. Everything is seems like it's local. You even have the built-in terminal of VS Code that is then run via SSH, and so on. And this actually improved our productivity in all of the support and maintenance projects a lot. Like and especially if somebody if some project runs there, it kind of never stops running, right? Because yes, we install new versions, and minor versions of PHP and so on and of Node are always like updated, but these minor updates usually don't cause any issues. Whereas when you have like all of that on your local environment on a Mac, especially if you use Homebrew, like the officially supported PHP versions, are only those that you get normal updates for, right? So while there are like tabs, homebrew tabs, like special repositories that also will give you more legacy versions, there's always something where you run into issues with these kind of things. So by moving to a Linux-based like centralized support server, we have increased our productivity a lot.
So when you talk about these dependencies and why it takes so much time to set up a project, this is mostly the build process, right? And the process we use to basically run the project in the first place, right? So what kind of things are running there then in a typical installation? It's npm packages, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we like in the very early days we used Gulp and Browserify probably, and then we switched to Webpack and stayed with Webpack for a couple of versions, and now the latest version is built with Vite and Rollup because
And I remember one of the biggest problems there usually is, especially like with older projects, is that those dependencies, those npm packages, have been installed with a specific npm version.
Mm-hmm.
And you needed to know which npm version was used to build that project in order to run it correctly. Because if you just like tried using the latest Node version, then that wasn't compatible with some of the packages, and you actually couldn't run the whole project. So before starting to work on it, you needed to update the whole build process, and depending on the packages, the dependencies we used, this was or can be very, very tough to do and a lot of work. And with like ensuring that we have the development environment preserved on this remote server, we're kind of fixing that. So it's like this one computer that would lie around in the office that everyone would have access to, basically. However, the limitations, if I understand correctly, are that only one person at a time can work on one project, right?
Yes. Yeah. And for a normal maintenance project, that's totally fine. Just when you get bigger jobs to do. But then also often it's then a good time to update all the dependencies if you get like a bigger job to like add more features, functionality, and so on. Then a lot of the times it makes more sense to update the build process and do that instead of like carrying through like this legacy stuff. And like what you said, like about the npm or Node version, that's totally true. However, we also have been using a Node version manager for ages, right? Like from the start, so that you can easily switch. But I remember, like especially back in the day when Node 0.12, I think it was like from Node 0.12 to what was it, to Node 4 or something? I don't exactly remember. There even like packages just vanished, right? So you couldn't, like packages were completely removed from npm, so you couldn't install these anymore. For that, like this probably doesn't happen that much anymore because people have gotten used to it and like seen those problems and issues. But still, it's good to have one source of truth that stays the way it is, like that you can just like log in and say, okay, I'm running this as if I was working on it 2 years ago, right? So and there's
because it also like who is responsible for maintaining that, right? And we've had this issue probably a couple of times that we would need to explain very much in depth to people why we would charge them a lot of effort now for doing a small change on the website when they're coming back like 2 years later. And it was not like that like years and years ago. But today's development stacks are just like so complicated that they're a piece of software on their own to maintain that. Just like the deployment process was a build process. So this is something we call the dev environment typically. Then we have a local environment, which is the one running on the developer's computer. What other environments do we typically set up, and how do they play together technically?
Yeah, so it again, it depends, right? The easiest setup would be then to just have a production environment. That means the production environment is usually then owned by the client, or they host it with us. We basically, when we go live, we deploy, since we use NPM, or since we use a node-based build process, and also we want to keep our repos as clean as possible, but also include all of the information that's necessary, right? So in our repos, we actually use a composer JSON, a composer file, to specify what WordPress dependencies we have and install them via composer. We don't check them in. We only check in the composer JSON. And also we do not check in the artifacts from the build process, right? So the dist folder or whatever. We don't check that in either, because when we like do pull request reviews and also like want to see what happened in a project, there's so much noise if you keep all of this stuff in, and we want to focus on really the stuff that we changed, like, right? Not that somebody else changed. If we update a plugin, we just want to know that we updated that version, but we don't want to know what kind of files changed in this plugin, right?
Yeah.
So that means we always need a build process, and we don't want to depend on a developer's machine to do the build process right? Because you can always have some local setup, like things that are not really reflected in the repository. So what we do, we have a continuous integration, continuous deployment service. Like we use an external service for that we are really happy with, that we really like. Like there we build the like we run composer install, we run npm install, we run npm run build. So all of the build process is being done on this CD server, and then we deploy the code to a production server, right? And initially we either migrate the content from dev, with content I mean the database and the uploads, to production, or if the client just wants to start with a blank slate before going live, maybe on a subdomain or on some other domain, we just deploy an empty installation, and then they can basically enter their content, and once they are done with that, we will go live with the production server. So this is the easiest setup that you get from us. So it's local, dev, and production. Sometimes...
Wait, I guess maybe what I said before was a little confusing, because I think I might have called the development environment, or the maintenance and support server environment, the development environment. But that's not the development environment. Local is the computer.
Yes.
Production is the live site, and development is typically the one where we deploy from local to.
Yes.
So kind of like a testing server, something where we send changes to people, we test them ourselves, and when we ask our clients to review things. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then there's this other thing, the maintenance server, which is just like a total different environment. It's kind of like a local environment in the cloud.
Exactly. That's why for me, this is the local environment. It's a local environment that's just not on your computer.
Yeah.
But that's the one that you should always use, like a local one. And you also, like, while it's in the cloud and while we have URLs for that are accessible everywhere, this is not something we show the client, right? That's not a preview URL, because you wouldn't also, at least that's how we do it. We wouldn't like publish our local, from our computer, our local environment, make it available through some URL and then show it to the client. No, we always like, if the client sees something, that's on dev or on production or on staging, which is like another environment that we haven't talked about.
And that's kind of like why I'm also like sometimes still getting confused, because all these names like, okay, you're testing on the dev environment, though the dev is not where we develop, but it's more like where we have the latest development version, kind of, right? And where we can develop several versions too. And then typically when people ask like, do you have a staging environment? Then some consider this to be a staging, although it's not a real staging environment.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not a clone from production. It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it always depends on how you define a staging environment, right? But for me, like also when talking to clients, their staging environment is where they can maybe change content and check content changes before they put them on production, right? In WordPress, you don't need that necessarily, because you have a preview functionality, right? You can always like save drafts and preview stuff. But still, sometimes you want to make bigger changes. But the problem is why also in the more complicated cases, we split development and staging, and that's also why we have such a distinct naming, is that on development, things can, like the code can change, not voluntarily, but it can change like without any notice, right? So whenever the master branch is updated, or the main branch, sorry, then the changes are deployed to dev. And sometimes the client wants to enter content, wants to make changes, to test things out. And for this, we then set up a staging environment where we know that deploying something can cause issues with the client. And so we just don't deploy there. We deploy there basically the same as on a production environment, right? Or like if we have a big feature that needs to be rolled out and the client wants to make a lot of content changes and so on, we put that on staging and then later migrate the stuff from staging to production. However, right, there are other strategies, and some clients, even like especially in the past, they wanted to have a staging environment that they would then sync with production, right? So actually that nobody would ever log into production, but everyone would work on staging, and then either with a click of a button or at a certain like a time of the day, things would then be synchronized. Yeah. But this is like from my experience, I haven't seen any good like workflow with this approach.
It's just like I had this question in my mind, like why not like do every setup like this, like consistent local dev, staging, production, and then like real staging where you deploy. And the simple answer for me is, well, just because every step in the process increases the complexity and makes it more complicated and more effort to deploy things, right? Sometimes when we do this, that we have an actual staging where even the content changes within WordPress are made on staging and then synced to the production server with code deployment and database deployment. That is kind of the motivation typically, is then having more control over what's on production and having like hardening the security, because then on the production server the file integrity can be watched even better, and even the database integrity or whatsoever. But yeah, you're always reliant on those people who do have access to this one button.
Yeah.
And that's a bottleneck, of course. It's not like the dynamic way of quickly changing things. So what's actually your preferred way? What's your favorite stack and in terms of environments?
I like usually basically just to have a production environment. In most of the cases, that's totally enough, right? Production, dev, local. Because the staging environment, like again, in WordPress, it's really easy to preview things and to make small code changes that content changes that are not immediately visible, but that you can test. And I mean, WordPress is not, anyways, not the best platform for like a really sophisticated editorial workflow either, right? So
it's quick and easy,
yeah,
and
exactly.
flexible, right? But it's not this like structured editorial software.
Yeah. And while there are plugins that will enable something like that, like I've found none of them really reliable or any good or fun to use or whatever. Maybe with the changes in like collaborative editing and things like that, maybe this like changes. But yeah, so for me, it should be as simple as possible is always the goal, right? All, like and for that we have, yeah, again, a production environment, a dev environment that's only for the developers, where actually we only rarely show the client some changes if things like when things are done. Or actually, yeah, and now we come to a point where it depends again, right? Because if we talk about projects where the development is actually kind of done with the go live, then you don't need a staging. But if you have like a more of a key account thing, that like an ongoing project, an ongoing client where the website is already live and you continuously develop new features, then you definitely need a staging environment. Because I prefer not to give the client access to the dev environment, because the dev environment is for the developers and things break there and you need to like remove maybe all the content again and make some changes. And if the client like looks at it, it's like, oh, my website is broke. Why are you breaking things? And then say, yeah, it's only it's just an intermediate step that you will never see on the production website, right? And then you should develop something there. And once it's done and you want to like get the clearance, like, or the go from the client, you deploy it on staging to have them review it. And yeah.
Well, yeah, I think we're doing it sometimes like this, sometimes like that, or depending on the type of project and intensity of the project. Because I also remember like with support and maintenance contracts where we don't have the strict staging environment, this can happen. Like working on two features at the same time, you deploy one to the dev environment to check it for yourself, but then you want to get clearance from a client and send them that link to the dev environment. And then like an hour later, you work on something else, deploy, and forgot that this will override the other one. Then they can't see that. And that's not so nice. No. But like there are multiple solutions probably, but the most solid solution would be having then again a staging environment for every kind of project. And this is just another step in terms of complexity. Also, when it comes to cloning assets and content like the database, this can be pretty tough, right? To keep things nicely in sync.
Yeah. So first of all, I think if you work on something alone, I think it's totally fine not to have this staging thing, probably, because you should know what you deploy, right? Even if you work on two different features. But in a team with multiple people working on the same project on different features, there we have run into issues, and there it's where I've repeatedly also told the team to talk to each other, right? Talk to each other and see like, okay, if there's the need for that, right? If multiple people want to show different things to the client, then yes, we need a different environment. And while like the optimal case, and you see that like, that's why I'm sometimes a little bit envious about like statically generated sites and so on, right? Or static projects where you can easily just spin up a new environment for like every branch that you have a new environment that you can visit, right? And that's what you now played at, right? The keeping your staging environment, your dev environments, and also like maybe other environments in sync with production, or at least in sync with a representative data set, right? And I've recently seen there's like this new startup that is offering these things. Like I forgot the name now, but they have like this technology to they take every night, they do a snapshot of the production database, and then you can use those as snapshots on your local projects, like either on these other environments, or when spinning up like new instances for single branches, for example.
And that's for WordPress or just like general?
No, that's in general for like any kind of projects. I haven't looked deeply into that, but I've seen they are sponsoring a couple of conferences and so on, and it seems to be something really nice. However, for me, this is like a workflow thing, because syncing a database is not that hard, theoretically, right? Of course, there's a slowdown. Like you don't want to slow down production when you do stuff, but. And now we come back to the topic, to one of our earlier topics. It's about private data where you really have to watch out.
Oh, right.
Because sometimes you collect personal data in a project, right? And even like, not sometimes, every time you collect personal data, because all of the people that have user accounts, they have their personal email address there. This is sometimes like when it's only client, then it's like kind of fine. But if there are other users that register, or if you maybe save some other private personal data on the website, then you need to sanitize that before exporting that to another server, right? And
even like when cloning, like it's just like nice, even if it's legally okay, to not just copy over all that data to other environments and all local environments and so on, but just like to really focus on the code. And at the same time, the data can get like really, really big, and where do you save that? We had also different approaches in the past years, right, on how to sync data, remote data, like assets, big assets, images and videos and so on. Probably a topic on its own, syncing database assets. But maybe let's recap on, so what is a typical workflow or setup environment for which type of project? How would you call that? Or like, I'm just having in my mind that when it's a project, when we're relaunching a website, it's more like the dev environment changes to become a staging environment more or less at a later point in time. Whereas on maintenance and support projects it's different, and on ongoing projects it's different. So what is a typical workflow of dev and staging and production environments when we set that up?
Well, typically for a project where we have a fixed project and then go into maintenance mode, right? And with maintenance mode, I mean, from that point on, there's only like bug fixing and updates, right? So then we basically we have our dev environment, that's where it starts always. And then we create the local environments from that. And we do all the development. And then at some point in time, we actually give the client access usually to the dev environment. And they enter the content and do everything that they want until they say, yeah, that's good. And then we deploy to production. And then we actually close off the dev environment, right? So we give the dev environment usually then a different password, like a different basic auth password, so that also the client doesn't get confused by, okay, where am I changing content now, right? So, and then and then when we hit maintenance mode, basically when we go into maintenance mode, we set up this project on on the support server. So we have like this externalized local environment, so that from then on, like you don't even like the people who worked on the project don't have to have that project on their local machine anymore, but they could just like log in to the dev server. But actually, it's not that big of a deal to have a project on your local machine, because you can always also remove the database, remove the images or the uploads, because the next time you will need to work on it, you just run clone and then you have it again. So that's actually really really nice.
That's a WP CLI command cloning the assets and the database, right?
Yeah, well, it's our own script. So we have our own bash file, but we use the WP CLI to clone the database and replace the strings in the database, because that's also like something for WordPress that's special. That makes things a little bit more complicated. That you always have the hard-coded URL kind of inside of the database. Yeah, and the uploads we get with rsync, like so it's a manual rsync call. So that's for this kind of project. And then for the projects where we either take on a project or where we do development, and then instead of going into maintenance mode, we have like ongoing developments for like multiple features over a longer period of time. And for that, we then usually create a staging environment. We also, if there are teams working on multiple features simultaneously, we also set up a more complex Git workflow usually, because just having a main branch and then a production branch and the feature branches that you work on is sometimes not enough. But you have to like have a development branch or like a bigger feature branch, right? That you maybe want to branch off of, so that multiple people can merge their stuff without having to merge into the main branch, right? Where
it's almost more like a release branch, pre-release.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, and there we work with a staging environment then usually.
And what is it that you would like to look into for the future still? What is it where you see that going, like all these environment stuff? Because there are other vendors, let's call it, and technologies which try to make it really easy, especially for WordPress to clone a production environment, to work on different environments. Where do you see the future of that going? Or what is it that you would like to still improve, or I just like all happy with that?
Yeah, as I said, I'm looking envious a little bit towards these static frameworks, right? Or where you can just spin up a branch, like a whole environment for a branch that you have, and I think that is pretty awesome. Also, like there has been like there's so much going on in the integrated dev environments, right? So when you look at companies like StackBlitz or Code Sandbox that run entire development environments in your browser, and where you have like these, you basically, if you have a static page that's checked into GitHub and you see a bug, you can say, okay, or you have a pull request, you can say open in StackBlitz, whatever, right? And then everything gets loaded and you get like this environment just for this pull request. And this is stuff like, this is actually really awesome. And
this would be really cool. Like if we just like in the future we don't depend on like real local environments anymore, but we can just basically take the code, spin up any kind of environment quickly with a push of a button. And I'm seeing like also developments like in GitHub where you can just press open it in a virtual VS Code environment, right? So and Insta WP, where you can like spin up different WordPress environments. So yeah, that I think that would be really cool, being independent from local physical computers, but being able to have even more flexible development and testing and staging environments, and making that stuff easier. That would be great if there would be some more development happening.
Yeah, there is a lot of development happening. Maybe
Okay.
maybe we have to. Maybe next year we'll have another talk about how this is done and how we use it now. Yeah,
See, I
but
wouldn't be
this
surprised.
is awesome. Like I'm all for that. You know.
Great. Well, then let's see how we probably got to do a follow up then next year. What changed about it?